can I list to you 10 arguments? By the way, I'm getting these, or 20 arguments, just so you have a sense of the range of kinds of arguments that are out there. This is from a wonderful website I'll recommend to you called strangenotions.com. Strangenotions.com by a wonderful guy named Brandon Vaught. The first 10 of these arguments are what can roughly be called cosmological arguments. The cosmos means the universe, so it refers to starting with the data out there. The second 10 I'll mention are called psychological arguments, roughly, because it begins with stuff in here, like in the psyche, in the person. So one is outside in, one is inside out. So here are 10 cosmological arguments. And I'll go into detail on the first one. The argument from change, the argument from efficient causality, the argument from time and contingency, the argument from degrees of perfection, the design argument, the Kalam argument, the argument from contingency, the argument from the world as an interacting whole, and the argument from miracles. Those are just 9, I guess. Those are 9 cosmological arguments. So you start with each one: time, the universe as a whole, design, contingency, motion, change, etc. And then you argue to, therefore God exists. That's how they all more or less work. And then the next 11, again, psychological arguments. The argument from consciousness, human consciousness. The argument from truth. The argument from the origin of the idea of God. The ontological argument from St. Anselm. The moral argument, that's the one I'll mention a few things about in a little bit more depth. The argument from conscience. Conscience, not consciousness, but conscience, my sense of right and wrong in certain situations. The argument from desire. The argument from aesthetic experience. Oh, that's beautiful. The argument from religious experience. Whoa, that's transcendent and tremendous and fascinating and a little scary. The common consent argument. Most people have believed in God across human history. And then finally, Pascal's wager. That's kind of a weaker one. It's more like, it's a good idea to go in this direction. You know, it's like a smart bet. Anyway. So there's a lot more, but those are just 20 to give you a sense of there's 10, the cosmological kind and the psychological kind. Gotcha? Got it? So let's just dip our toes into, first, the argument from change, and then the argument from moral argument. I'm not going to leave that slide up the whole time. I do one slide every half hour. So argument for motion. Here's how it works. I'll walk you through, then we'll just address some of the aspects of it. First, things change. Secondly, things move. This is drawn very much from Thomas Aquinas, one of his ways, the first way. And for him, move and change is the same kind of thing. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Things move or change. And since nothing moves itself, everything that is moved must be moved by another. You can't move yourself. You can't pick yourself up by the hair and put yourself up on a higher ridge. If that which causes the motion is itself being moved, then it must be moved by another, right? So no mind-blowing stuff here so far. He's beginning with common sense experience of just how we experience things around us. Fourth, this process can't go on to infinity. This process that he mentions in number 3, the motion being caused can't be caused by the thing itself. It has to be caused by another if that other thing is being moved. And if it's being moved and it's not moving itself, it has to be moved by another. That process can't go on to infinity. And now the conclusion, boop, there it is. There must therefore exist a first unmoved mover, which people call God. First of all, here's why I like this one, why I went with it. Because first, it addresses things on a real macro level. Like if you're kind of a physics person and you're into like the Big Bang and the expansion of the universe, and you get a sense that the whole universe, I mean the macro thing, everything that there is in an experience of flux and change, like the entropy of energy and all that stuff. The universe being 13 billion plus years old. The argument works on that level. It also works on a smaller level, like mountains. Like mountains are slowly changing through erosion because the air is like working on mountains. If you fast forwarded like a camera on a mountain, you see it's changing. It also works, I think, on a personal level. I just turned 40 a couple weeks ago. I'm changing. I'm changing. There's a kind of spiritual power in this too, because now that I've turned 40, I'm starting to wonder, like, when are my knees going to start hurting? Or even imagine that you're at someone's deathbed, someone who you love, and the change that you see happening before you is not so promising. All of a sudden, it's not just like an abstract, how do I account for this change as a philosopher? It's how do I make sense out of this in a spiritual, more existential way. So that's why I kind of like this argument. Now, I'll just mention a few things about these 4 premises up to the conclusion. So everything we experience is in a process of motion. For Thomas, that's not like, look at that roadrunner go. It's broader than that. It's more of change. Things are in a process of change. This is deeply related to what Thomas notices as time. Time. Time conditions everything around us. Again, like I mentioned, mountains seem like they're not changing, but if you just go enough time, they are changing, right? Geological formations, they're changing and erosion. But think of it like right here. So those lights, would you say those lights are changing right now? Right in front of you? Sure, they're changing. They're in motion, Thomas would say. How? Well, because they're using up, like I'm not an engineer. We have some engineers here who could tell me exactly what change is happening in those lights, because those light bulbs aren't going to last forever. Eventually, something happens and they're done. They've changed. Now you got to get new ones. A tree is in motion, even though it's not running around. It's not locomotion. Do the locomotion. But it's still motion in and of itself. So that's the kind of change or motion that Thomas is talking about. Again, give me anything in your experience that's not in motion. Anything. Well, I was sleeping last night. Yeah, but you were changing, weren't you? You're getting more dehydrated. That's why you need water when you get up in the morning, right? Things are happening in your bladder. That's why you got to get up in the middle of the night. You're in constant change. The one constant is change. That's why Thomas begins with this one, because it's so elementary to our experience. What allows Thomas to see this is what he calls potency and act. So potency and act. Potency is a capacity to be different. I'm 40 now, thank God. But I have a capacity to move or change to be 41 through the passage of time if I just keep myself out of moving traffic for the next year. Well, where does that capacity come from to make that movement or that change? Do I myself have in me another year of time in me that I can give to myself? No, of course not. I can't just give myself another year of time. So I depend on something outside of myself to move that potential to actuality. And in this case, it's called the passage of time, right? I need 351 more days to get there. But I don't possess those 351 days. They're outside of myself. They're moving me to be 41 years old. So don't just think of like a baseball moving through space, like the air or something. Thomas means movement or change in the most basic sense. Now, premise 2, since nothing moves itself, everything that is moved must be moved by another. So to explain the change, I've already gestured at it with my little age thing. You have to make a reference to something outside the thing that's changing or being moved. Other things have to be involved. Nothing can give to itself what it doesn't already have. If it did already have it, it's already actually there. And you can't say that's change. It's already there. The changing thing begins with only the potential to change, not the actual change itself. It needs to be acted on by another. So here's a great example. It's probably the classic one you may have gotten in philosophy class if you ever took one in college or high school. The train, right? So you walk outside and you see the trains going by, the boxcars. And you got out and so you don't see the end, you don't see the beginning. You see one, and you just look at that one car with the cows on it and it's going by. And so you say, what's moving that thing? I need to account for the fact that it's moving. And you look a little bit in front of the cows, and what do you see? Another boxcar. Now, how is it that that boxcar is moving the other thing? Well, because it's about 10 meters in front of the other one. So it has the actual location to pull the other boxcar to where it is. Problem solved, right? Now we know why the boxcar is moving. No. We're just getting started. Because that other boxcar has cattle in it, more cattle. And they're not driving the train. So You got to go ahead. So you see where we're going with this. So you've got all these boxcars moving forward. And each one is causing the other one to move. So it's a causal chain. You've got a nexus, a causal chain of nexus. This is just an example for what Thomas sees with the light, with me turning 40, with you sitting in front of me, with anybody you love, every tree you see outside, and the whole universe. It's like that boxcar moving along. Let me fast forward to 3 and 4. If that which causes the motion of itself is being moved, it must be moved by another. So what I mentioned there is you can't possess the change already that you don't already have. It's just irrational, right? I'm already 41, but I'm not 41 yet, so that's just nonsense. So how can that process not go on forever? Why can't you just have infinite boxcars? Like you say to your neighbor, where's the engine of the train? And your neighbor says, there ain't no engine. It's just a really long train. It goes on forever. It's been going on forever. But you haven't answered the question of why is that one boxcar with the cows in it moving? You haven't given a sufficient explanation. All you've done is just move the causal chain and just made it longer. For Thomas, and here's where most people today, when they hear this argument, it's where most go wrong with it. When they hear like the train thing, they think it's like a linear series. And so that what Christians do in an argument like this is we say, we just get sort of tired of a really long set of series, and we just say, I don't know why I always want to do it in like a Southern Baptist accent, but therefore God did it. Therefore it's God pulling the train. And then so maybe our atheist friend might say, why do you have to say it's God? Why can't you just let the train be a super long train that just goes on forever? But Thomas isn't talking about simply a linear series. What he's talking about is a hierarchical series. So a linear series explains how this boxcar is moving this boxcar in like chronological and spatial steps. So a train is spatial, right? It's moving across space. Or think about like temporally, like who caused you to exist? Your mommy and your daddy. And who caused them to exist? Their mommy and their daddy. And then you go back and back, right? But that doesn't explain why you're sitting here right now, because your mom and dad may be dead. So that doesn't explain why you're sitting here right now. That's a hierarchy. What Thomas is getting at is not like your mom and your dad who procreated you and now you exist. That's not what he's talking about. It's not what the train thing is about. It's a hierarchical arrangement where here and now, I need to explain how this train is moving right now. Do you see what I mean by hierarchical? It's simultaneous. So it's think about, does anybody like golf? A hierarchical causal chain, which Thomas is getting at here in terms of moving. So we'll go with golf, right? So what he's talking about is the head of the club is moving in the golf swing. Well, what's moving that? Well, it's the shaft of the club. Okay. Have you explained the movement of the head of the club? No. What's moving the shaft? Your hands. What's moving the hands? Your arms. What's moving your arms? Your shoulders. What's moving that? Your back. What's moving that? Your lower body. Now, if at any moment you take out any of those pieces, guess what happens to the head of the club? It just stops moving. That's what Thomas is getting at in this. God is needed not as just some like start the train up and push it out, but he's needed at every moment to maintain the whole linear series. The engines, to go to that analogy, the engine here and now has to be pulling every single boxcar. This is not inserting God into like science. Like I was joking about the Christian dude who's like, it's Jesus inside of every single little molecule. And if you zoom in and Jesus is like, hi, it's me, little Jesus in the molecules. That's not what's going on here. That would be a linear causal series. But this is a hierarchical causal series. The typical objection to this, Richard Dawkins, who's one of the so-called new atheists these days, he attacked Aquinas' argument saying that Thomas's argument is basically this, and this is a caricature. Everything needs a cause, therefore there had to be a first cause called God. Third, but God's the exception to the rule. He doesn't need a cause. So it's a kind of fallacy attack called special pleading. So everything has to have a cause, but God gets off the hook. He doesn't need one. Why? I don't know, because he's special. And then he says, you Christians aren't honest, because you don't apply your premise across the whole board. But Thomas Aquinas isn't saying everything needs a cause. That's not one of the premises. Rather, what Thomas is claiming is everything in motion only moves because it has a potential to move. Everything moves only because it has a potential to move. Nothing can move of itself. An object only moves if its potential to move is actualized by something outside of it. The boxcar only moves if the train in front, if it's being pulled. I only get older if I, in fact, am alive in the chronological flow of history. What makes God different isn't that he's an exception to the rule, but that he has no potential at all. He's pure act, to use another expression of Thomas. To say it another way, he's absolute motion. Don't think of that as like he's moving really fast in outer space. No, he has no potential. He's unchangeable, not like a rock which doesn't change, but there's no capacity in him for change whatsoever. There's no potential in him, which allows him to be the engine that drives change at every corner of the universe. Not as one thing in the universe, like another boxcar, but as the unmoved mover, to use Thomas's wonderful mystical expression. Thomas is saying that since everything that changes has potential in it, if it didn't have potential in it, how could it be changing? But everything around us is changing. Therefore, everything has potential in it. Therefore, there must be something which has no potential in it in order to explain that these things have potential. Otherwise, where in the world did they get their potential from? Again, and that you can apply that to the whole universe and the law of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics, right down to the fact that your pastor is getting old, has a couple more gray hairs. How about one more? I want to do the moral argument. So if you found that last one unmoving, it's either because I screwed it up or because you just didn't find it persuasive. A lot of people aren't moved by moving kind of the outward stuff outside of us to an argument from God. It sometimes can seem kind of cold. So let me do a psychological argument, moving from our interior subjective experience towards God. Here's the moral argument. Number one, objective moral truths exist. Again, each one of these premises has to be defended on its own. That's how arguments work. You have to defend the premises and defend the soundness of the logic that leads to the conclusion. Secondly, these objective moral truths have either a natural or a supernatural explanation, one or the other. Thirdly, natural origins are insufficient to explain objective moral truths. Conclusion, therefore, objective moral truths have a supernatural origin in God. Obviously, the logical extrapolation of that is therefore God exists. The reason I thought I like this one and find it helpful is because it has a strong emotional impact, because we're just so hard. We're all a bunch of little righteous indignation animals, aren't we? You know what I mean? Like everyone is just into their thing now, right? Hashtag fill in the blank. We are all righteously indignant about something. And I say thank God for that. For the moment we're little kids, we go, that's not fair. And we just keep doing it our whole lives. And you want to temper it with love and prudence and all that. But I like it because it taps into sort of that energy. It's objective in the sense that it's universal. You got these objective moral norms which seem to operate in every culture. We'll address that as a premise in a second. But it's also internal, because I myself experience in my own heart shame or guilt when I do something wrong and nobody knows about it, except Father Camus. And I experience not just like that I made a mistake, but that I broke a law, a voice, right? And it's hard for me to put my head on my pillow because I don't feel alone in that shame. Or I did something good. I made a huge sacrifice of love or of generosity nobody else knows about, and I feel a deep peace in that. How do you explain that? So I love this argument because it taps into both the interior and the exterior. Now, please keep in mind, as I say moral argument, don't think that what Father Muir is saying, oh, so people who believe in God do good things, people who don't believe in God do bad things. No. What this argument is right there. It means that the existence of God grounds objective moral norms. That's the extent of what this argument is. Both a believer and a non-believer can rescue a cat from a tree. Okay, you both can do it. And if you see a cat in a tree, I'll just leave that up to your own conscience. Okay. So moral truths. What do moral truths refer to? They refer to statements about right and wrong that are objectively true regardless of human opinion. Like scientific statements. What's the rate of acceleration for gravity? 9.8 meters per second squared or something? So like whatever the rate of gravity, like that's true, whether or not we like it or whether or not we're in Madagascar or Mozambique, it's just true. So that's the claim. So that's what it means by objective moral norm. The moral means that it's related to right and wrong, good and evil. There's an objective moral value that's good to do or that's bad to do, which puts on me an objective moral norm, an obligation. Like the way, like one time I broke a little traffic law here in front of the church, and a duly deputized official of the city of Avondale in a police car went and pulled me over. And he has the authority given by the Avondale to do that, and I had an obligation to be pulled over lest I end up in a high-speed chase in front of the parish. So that's kind of what we're getting at with objective moral norms, that these moral norms are given, not created by human beings. You may say, well, yeah, but all we can really know is through our five senses. Really. There's all sorts of ways that we know things without our five senses. And I'm not just talking about hunches and things like that. There's a cool thing called proprioception. Proprioception. It's not one of the five senses. Did you know you have a sixth sense? It's the sense by which you can tell with your eyes closed which parts of your body are yours and which parts are someone else's. How about this? We know our memories are our own in our mind's eye, the capacity of memory, a kind of memory sense. And we also know that other people's minds exist and they're not just sophisticated robots pretending to be other people. Now consider the strength of, again, well, there's no such thing as moral norms, right? It's all just my subjective opinion. It's my aesthetic. It's how I was raised. It's kind of culturally conditioned. Thought experiment. Our wonderful parish director of mission advancement, Jeff Strickland, runs up to me with it. This is going to be gruesome. He runs up to me with a big axe and just plunges the axe into my head, and I go down, and it's really bad. Blood spurting everywhere. Now, which of these three things do you spontaneously think? The blood spurting out of his head is a really nice parabolic arc. Secondly, I used to think senseless murder with an axe was against moral norms. But now I don't think so. Thirdly, that is terrible! Why did he murder him? Ah! That is so wrong! I hope that's your thing. Thank God we got rid of our pastor. No. It's probably the third one. In fact, if you press it in this little thought experiment, what else might you be tempted to question? Did that just happen? Was that real? Something that horrific, that repugnant to moral reasoning. Was that real? You might even say, I don't think that was real. You're going to doubt your sense experience before you doubt the moral norm. Isn't that interesting? Interesting. Okay. Now, C.S. Lewis is helpful with this. He called it the Tao. He borrowed that from Chinese philosophy, where he saw the Tao stands for this basic set of common moral values and obligations that are across cultures. Care for your parents, promote justice and honesty, etc. In the West, we call this basic set of moral norms natural law. Now, some will say that there's such widespread disagreement about these that you can't really say that there is a common core. But if you look closely at disagreements that people have morally, what you find almost indefinitely is not a disagreement over the norm, but over the facts. So there's like these cannibal groups in Africa, and guess what they believe it's wrong to do? Eat human beings. But what they do is they say that those things that we eat are not human beings. The other tribe, they're not human beings. How do you think the Nazis justified killing Jewish people? How about all the disagreements over our hot button issues in like the sexual ethical realm? They're not disagreeing with, the disagreements aren't over, is it wrong to, it's about the fact. It's the facts that are up for grabs, not the moral norms. Is that a man or a woman? Well, we're going to fight over that, right? But we're not going to fight over whether or not consensual sexuality, like the act of consent, is an essential part of the sexual moral behavior. Do you see what I'm saying? No one is disagreeing that rape or consent all that stuff in the sexual realm, that we have basic agreement on that stuff, but we disagree on other facts. I'm lifting this up not to make you nervous or something, but just to point out that objective moral norms exist. Now, can they be explained naturally? There's different natural sources that we could argue that moral norms come from. You can kind of go from the ground up. Like below me, that would be like from evolution or instincts. A lot of people argue that. It's like an extension of my instincts. So the moral norms that we have as a culture are basically the offshoot of just evolutionary development. What used to be morally bad is now morally good. Or the strong people survive, the weak people die, and then the morality is built around that. But here's the problem. Here's the problem with that. Just saying that our morality is an offshoot of instinct doesn't answer the question. It just pushes it back. Again, to quote C.S. Lewis again, he said our instincts, like our basic biological instincts, are what? Fight, flight, eat food, shelter, reproduce. Those are like the keys on a piano, he said, our instincts. But the moral norms tell you what you ought to do, not what's actually happening, like instincts, or what you want to do. Those are instincts. The moral norms are what you ought to do. That's why we say it's like a voice in my conscience. What I should do. It's like the sheet music on the piano. But it's ridiculous to say the sheet music is one of the keys on the piano. That doesn't make any sense. So it doesn't explain it by saying that our moral norms are just instincts. Because there's sometimes when the moral norm is against an instinct. Like I want to save myself, but I see someone drowning in a river who I don't even know, and maybe I don't even like him or her. Maybe I think they're like the weak member of the herd. And yet, what do I know I have to do? Jump in the water and save them. Yeah. There's the sheet music. So I'm not going to play the flight key. I'm going to play the fight, jump in the river key. Good. Maybe just from the individual. Can we say that moral norms come from the individual? Like my own personal experience. That's right for me, but it's not right for other people. Here's one way that doesn't hold water. Think of the experience of the conscience as a voice. John Henry Newman loved this. By the way, he's quoted in the Catechism when he says, the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ speaking in the human soul. If you want an example of this, next time the doorbell rings and you're in the shower, just like walk out butt naked into the living room and answer the door. Like if it's your dog ringing the doorbell, will you feel embarrassed? No, your dog's probably seen you naked before. I mean, who am I to judge? But let's say it's the Amazon guy. Package! Ah! How is the experience of your dog seeing you, as nature intended, and the Amazon guy is seeing you as nature intended? Assuming that you're not married to the Amazon guy. Another person is seeing me right now. Another person is seeing me. That's what Newman wants us to see of the conscience. A voice, right, of a lawgiver. Here's what Bonaventure said. Say Bonaventure said, the conscience in me is a blowing horn announcing the coming of the king. Isn't that good? Here he comes to bless you with a kind of soothing satisfaction because you followed his law, or to curse you with like the disappointed look of a father. What I want you to see in that analogy is it's not me alone in my own subjective taste, but rather I'm experiencing the echo of another voice in me. See, just saying that the moral norms are just my own preference or something doesn't explain that experience, which is so common. Think here of Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, in which he was trying to argue to other Christian pastors why discrimination against people of color is not just against the rules of the society, but the rules of the society were themselves unjust because, he said, they didn't conform to the moral law, which he said is rooted in divine law. Okay, the last place you see this argued, if it's not from myself, sometimes people say it's from the community or it's from science. There's one of the new atheists by the name of Sam Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Value. So it's just a thing that's in philosophy. It's the question of how do you move from an is to an ought, from a fact to a moral standard. And Sam Harris, the atheist argument, is that you can use science to get moral norms. The facts of science can lead you to morality. You don't need God to ground moral norms. You've got science. Now, he says, science teaches us, this is from his book, quote, you ought to improve the well-being of conscious creatures. So he does this little thought experiment. You can see it on YouTube with his debate with William Lane Craig, Sam Harris debating William Lane Craig. And he says, like, imagine a world where there's just total misery. Total misery. Everyone's just psychological and spiritual and physical agony. Now imagine a world where everyone is just totally flourishing, well-being. Which one is morally good? Well, of course, we all just instinctively say the latter. Like, give me the latter. That one, that's the moral world I want to live in. But the problem with that, so it's very tempting because it's a very beautiful kind of little thought experiment. But he equivocates on the word good. To say that the biological or psychological flourishing of a person or of a community ought to be done doesn't follow. How do you know you got a good football team? Okay, the Packers. How do you know the Packers are a good football team? They win. Yeah, that's how you know a football team's good. It wins. Does that mean the Packers are a morally good team? No. I hate to say it, but there may be a few examples in professional sports where you've got winning teams that aren't morally good in the team, or morally good individuals. So do you see how the word good there is used in two different ways? So something that may be effective or flourishing on a human level, a mechanical level, psychological level, emotional level, sexual level, etc., is not necessarily a moral norm. Is it good for a gun to not get jammed? Yeah, it's good insofar as the gun is flourishing. What if the gun is in the hands of someone in a school in Florida? See, again, I realize maybe that's too sharp of an analogy to use, but what I'm trying to get you to see is what Sam Harris doesn't understand is that science itself can't ground the moral norms, because science has dealt with how things operate and the mechanics of it, but it can't itself say that gun ought to be firing into that place. Does that make sense? So the word good there needs to be understood that moral goodness and scientific flourishing or biological flourishing, or the different levels that science has access to, are just different kinds of goodness. We're talking about a whole different level of goodness, moral goodness. Now, what about moral norms coming from God, a supernatural origin? So the basic argument here is that since nothing in nature, in the individual and culture, etc., can ground the moral norms, then it's best to ground them in the transcendent God, who himself is the source of all goodness. God provides a cognitive way to explain the existence of the moral norms. It explains how they don't change across time and culture. It also is a way to explain that there's a kind of like North Pole for the human conscience. And even if the compass breaks or is badly formed, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as north. But saying that there's a personal God who himself is the lawgiver is a way to explain this. I think it also explains the way we experience our conscience and God in a personal way in our conscience. Maybe I'll just mention one little, I'm going over time. Maybe I'll just mention one attack on this, where people, it's called the old Euthyphro dilemma from Plato. The attack says, hey, Christian, and your whole thing about God being the source of moral norms. Well, let me ask you this. Is that moral norm about not mutilating innocent children against their will bad because God says it's so? Or does God say it's so because it's bad? If you say it's bad because God says it's so, then God seems like an arbitrary tyrant. If you say God says it's bad because it is bad, then it sounds like it's outside of God's control, and he's just reacting to the bad stuff he sees, and then he seems weak and impotent and therefore not God at all. Here's how the Catechism of the Catholic Church handles it. I'd say on the horns of this dilemma, it splits the horns and puts them together. In God, here's the Catechism speaking, power, essence, will, intellect, wisdom, and justice are all identical. So, therefore, everybody, the ethical norms that we're talking about, that we experience in ourselves and culture and up and down the ages, flow from and participate in God's own goodness. They're good not because God says so, but because God is good, and they participate in his goodness. It's like saying, well, how do you know that a meter is 39.4 inches? Well, because that's the nature of what it means to be a meter. To be God is to be the one who grounds all goodness itself, who expresses his own logic in the universe in rational ways that can be identified by his rational creatures. Here's how William Lane Craig says it. He says, the answer is, he's a summary of this whole argument. The answer is that God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being, and a being which is the paradigm of goodness, and a being which is the paradigm of all goodness, is greater than one which merely exemplifies goodness. Unless we are nihilists, we have to recognize some ultimate standard of value, and God is the least arbitrary stopping point. In other words, Craig is saying it's arbitrary to stop at instinct, science, or culture as the source of moral norms, and at least arbitrary, and the least arbitrary and actually intellectually satisfying to stop at God as the personal source of all goodness, and therefore as the transcendent source of moral norms. And speaking of stopping points, the end. Thanks, everybody.